From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek talks about something that the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State has been looking into: open beef cows that were previously preg-checked positive. He tells why the cause is hard to pin down and says that determining what the cause isn't is just as important. Then K-State's Jaymelynn Farney talks with Oklahoma State University's Paul Beck about Paul's work with a new idea in supplementing distillers' dried grains to Stocker Calves on grass, presenting those DDGs in a cubed form. And for this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Raymond Cloyd on protecting ornamental trees with dormant oil treatments. All that here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Thanks for tuning in once again to another Agriculture Today. Well, we're welcoming back in, once again, from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University, the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit at that laboratory, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg is good to pass along to us with regularity here what's going on in the field of bovine health management here in Kansas. Gregg, you wanted to come by today because you and colleagues at the laboratory, you say, are hearing about and seeing examples of aborted calves out of those spring calving cow herds. And this obviously is worrisome. What's going on?
Well, we don't know exactly what's going on, but, you know, some of the things that we've dealt with this fall are normal abortion storms. We've had a couple of anaplasmosis cases. We've had 2 cases that I know of where cows were sent into corn stalks, and it was a nitrate poisoning issue. We've had one that was extremely moldy hay that they were on and confirmed that those calves were lost because of mold. As usual, there were several that we have no idea. The diagnosis came up with nothing. And then we've had 1 or 2 that was associated with IBR. So those were cases where we actually had a fetus, we had placenta, we had the normal things that we like to work up abortions. The thing that, and I don't know if we're seeing more of it, but the thing that I'm hearing, it seems like I've heard more about it in the last 4 to 6 weeks, are those cows that were presumably pregnant, declared pregnant months ago, and now look like they're open or are open.
And that presents an unknown here and something that's hard to get one's arms around as to what's going on. But you say there are a series of questions that need to be asked when looking at what's causing these preg-checked cows that were deemed as positive and now they're open.
Absolutely. There's some questions we have to ask because we have to determine, was it actually pregnancy losses or is this a fertility issue? And we don't want to go down both roads for a diagnostic. We want to go one road or the other. So some of the questions that we're gonna ask the veterinarian and the producer are they actually open? I mean, sometimes heifers and cows, sometimes it's nutritional, sometimes we don't know why. They're not springing and they're not uddering up like they normally would. Sometimes they're going to calve later than we think. They look open, but they're not. The other thing is, were they actually preg-checked? Or did we depend on not seeing cows bulling in the pasture? And so we said, well, you know, everybody's pregnant. We want to make sure that they were actually preg-checked. And then when is important because it kind of goes to the next point of who preg-checked, is that the earlier in gestation when they're preg-checked, the more technique, the more specialty that a person has to have. But the other thing is, we know that most of our fetal loss occurs in the first 60 or so days after breeding. And so we know that if we're preg-checking early, we're just normally going to lose some of those embryos through time. And so when were they preg-checked, what stage of gestation is really important. And then, like I said, who preg-checked? Do we use the blood test? Do we use an ultrasound? How exactly do we determine they're pregnant?
And these things all matter. For instance, how that preg checking took place, that can be an indicator, you say, one way or the other.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if we're doing a blood test, and those blood tests are good, and you can do it very, very early in gestation, but we know that about 5% of all of those that we call pregnant through a blood test are going to end up open. They're either open at the time and there's some carryover with the protein that we're looking at, or they're going to lose that fetus after that. So there's some things that maybe are normal. When we think we have embryo loss or pregnancy wasting, it's normal attrition. It's a normal part of the testing.
You brought up as well, Greg, who was responsible for that preg checking procedure, and the experience of that individual can make a difference.
It absolutely, and whether it's a veterinarian or whether it's a lay person, pregnancy checking, it is a skill that is developed. Obviously, if you're not using the ultrasound, you have to train your fingers to feel the structures, and so sometimes we find out that the person that was preg checking wasn't all that accurate. And so a lot of these cows that were called open were actually pregnant. And so, again, it's really important that we determine whether it's a pregnancy loss or whether it's a fertility issue.
Well, to that, if the decision's made that there is an issue here, that you have a cow that is open, it is difficult, you say, to trace that problem back retroactively.
It is. It's the lag time between the time they were declared pregnant to when we discovered that they're now open. We don't have a fetus. They obviously lost their calf. We don't have a fetus. We don't have placenta. And so some of the things that we're not going to be able to assess are a lot of our nutritional issues, whether it was a mold, a mycotoxin, something like that. There's no way for us to diagnose it without a fetus or in a placenta. Toxic issues. A lot of times if it's a nitrate or something that's toxic, it causes a problem, then it's gone. And so by the time we look at these cases, we really don't have anything to test to determine nitrates. Genetics. And occasionally we have genetic issues. If we don't have a fetus to look at the genetics in the sire and the dam, then we can't rule those things out. And then one of the most common bacteria that we deal with, there's several, is Listeria. And without a fetus, it's really very, very difficult to diagnose Listeria. So, yes, there's a lot of things that we won't have a clue whether that was contributing or not.
Might mention as well, while we're talking in these terms, even environmental stressors or impacts. Clearly, those would be hard to pin down as well, and they could be at work.
Absolutely. Heat stress or, like I said, nutritional issues, any of those kind of things. Those are things that happened in the past, and there's no way that we're going to be able to say they contributed to the problem or not.
So then, trying to come up with conclusive evidence of the reason these females are open. And you say the tack to take here is of value, and that is what can be ruled out as a cause. Explain, if you would.
Absolutely. And not everybody believes this, but I certainly do, and I think most of the people in our laboratory believe it. There are some infectious diseases that we can at least rule out and maybe rule in. And an example would be trichomoniasis or Campylobacter, which we used to call Vibrio. They usually cause early gestation losses, but not always. So if we think that's the case, we can sample the penis oils and or vaginal fluid, and we can rule out trich and Campylobacter from causing this fetal loss. Then there's 3 other organisms that we see contribute to bovine abortions, regardless whether it's spring or fall herds: BVD, 1 and 2, IBR, and lepto. And I really believe that if we look at the antibody levels of those animals that have aborted, knowing the vaccination history, that we can have a pretty good idea whether those organisms contributed to our fetal loss or whether they didn't play at all.
Are these the sorts of things that you have been encountering then, Greg, as you and others at the laboratory have received samples, have been working these cases?
Absolutely. Again, that's the only thing that a veterinarian can do if they diagnose fetal loss. The only thing that we have left to look at are the antibodies in the dams. And so we look at a lot of these. And over the last 4 to 5 weeks, like I said, we've diagnosed what we think are 2 cases of BVD was probably the contributing organism. And so we're going to do whatever we can to get BVD out of the herd. We've had at least 1 that was IBR, completely convinced that it was the contributor to this. 2 that were lepto. And then the other thing that we kind of forget about, there were 11 that we looked at these antibodies, and we said, you know what, we do not think that there's an infectious component here. And so those 11, we didn't say what it was, but we ruled out the BVDs, the IBRs, and the lepto. And so there is value to saying, I don't know what it is, but I know what it isn't.
Mm-hmm. And value in the sense that producers don't, to put it this way, go down a rabbit hole in trying to react to the issue.
Absolutely. I mean, if we determine it's a BVD issue, now we're talking about ear notching all the calves. I mean, there's a whole bunch of diagnostics to try to figure out whether source is IBR. There's some things that we have to do to determine what's going on there. So you're exactly right, is that if we just assume it's an organism, we can go down the wrong trail, spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and we're really not going to help prevent it the next time. And really that's our goal, is we're trying to prevent this from happening in the herd next year, next season.
Still, though, this is worth a conversation with your local practitioner. If you have cows turning up open that previously preg-checked to the positive, that's something that you need to talk over with your veterinarian.
Absolutely, and that's great point there, is that these pregnancy wastages, abortions, they are very complicated cases, and so having the veterinarian involved, and I'll say having the veterinarian preg-check your cows early so that you kind of know where you are as far as an open rate. Those are all beneficial things that producers can do.
And remember as well, aligned with that, the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State stands ready to work with producers on these confounding situations, such as what Gregg and company have come upon here in recent weeks. That is, once more, open cows that were thought to be pregnant in an early preg-checking round. Gregg, thanks for letting us know about this. Appreciate it. With the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, that's Gregg Hanzlicek. He stops by to visit about bovine health management routinely with us here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Well, it's a different twist on a long-time feedstuff preference for growing cattle, and it was the subject of a recent conversation between K-State Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney and a Stocker cattle nutritionist at Oklahoma State University, Paul Beck. He has just completed some promising new research on this approach to supplemental feeding stocker calves on grass. And as the host of this podcast, Dr. Jay's Beef, Jaymelynn, stokes the discussion here.
We were going to talk about supplementation for stocker cattle on some different types of grasses. So maybe just to provide a little background, why does a producer want or need to supplement cattle on grass?
Well, supplementation, is done for multiple different reasons. And, that's whether we're going to use it to correct some nutritional deficiencies. The most common one we think about in Oklahoma and Kansas for sure would be late season crude protein supplementation on summer grasses, native range. Correcting a degradable crude protein deficiency that really efficiently increases forage intake and increases gain. Other reasons is to use as a carrier for minerals or ionophores or other medicated feed additives. And also in looking at, drought conditions or just trying to intensify production on a certain piece of land, we can use it, supplementation, to replace forage intake and increase our carrying capacity. And that's a lot of what we're looking at on this research that we've been conducting essentially across the state of Oklahoma. I've got 2 rangeland sites in western Oklahoma, one at Fort Supply on a USDA station in far northwestern Oklahoma, and another at the Clemmy Range Research Station near the town of Bessie, Oklahoma, which is just south of Clinton. They're in far west central Oklahoma.
So what are you looking at supplementing, and why did you choose maybe that you're supplementing?
The supplement we're using is an extruded distiller's grains cube coming out of some of our ethanol plants in Nebraska. It's a real good solid cube, kind of a new extrusion process. If you remember, the earlier attempts at cubing distiller's grains didn't really work in a normal cubing process. One of the things keeping us from utilizing a lot of distiller's grains in pasture supplementation is, having to feed it in a feed bunk. We can't really feed it on the ground if it's loose ground material. And also in western Oklahoma, just the wind blowing it away can, lead to a lot of losses. And we've seen estimates of 15 to 25% loss on feeding these byproduct feeds on the ground in pasture settings. So, we're excited about being able to utilize a distiller's grain cube in order to being able to get away from using feed bunks, so we can distribute that cube, distribute grazing across the pastures much more effectively. And, it still retains the quality of, the distiller's grains. It's a mid-protein, 30 to 34% crude protein. It's got some bypass protein in there. We're estimating it to be about 50% ruminal bypass protein. And it's really high energy. It's got a lot of fat. The cubes we've analyzed are about 8% fat and very highly digestible. So we're able to get a really nice package of supplemental protein and energy to our cattle with this cube.
Yes, and you really were talking about the issues with the dry distillers, the blowing away and in the feed bunks. There's been state out at K-State at our Western Hayes Center that wet distillers is a whole different ball of wax when you go to try and feed it on the ground. They've been successful doing that. But if you don't live right next to a plant, you're more likely to be able to purchase dry distillers. So using that cube could be a really good option for the producers.
Yeah, I don't have the luxury of living next to an ethanol plant, so it's real hard to afford to haul that much water. And even though that wet distillers is a great product, it's really expensive once you get it hauled very far.
What did you take home out of this study?
Well, on our experimental design, we're in western Oklahoma on the rangeland sites. We're looking at a moderate stocking rate as our either a control or a positive control. And at the Fort Supply site, we have a negative control where these calves are stocked at right at 5 1/4 acres per calf. And they're either unsupplemented on the negative control, or in our positive control, we're using what we're kind of loosely defining as the old Oklahoma Super Gold program, where we're feeding 2.5 pounds of the distiller's grain cube supplement per head per day, and we're feeding that 3 days a week. Then at the Clemmy Range Research Station, we have fewer pastures, so we're basically comparing just that positive control to our alternative treatment, which is a 1/3 increase in stocking rate, along with 3/4% of body weight of these cubes fed, 5 days a week. So we're feeding about 5 pounds of these distiller's grains cube per feeding 5 days a week on those supplements. And what we found out in western Oklahoma was really exciting to us. And so we've done this in 2 years. The first year was a really good year. It was above average in rainfall for both of those areas. And we were able to increase our average daily gain with our supplement in our positive control compared to the negative control. And we really expected that. But we were also able to increase the average daily gain of those calves that were in that higher stocking rate and supplemented treatment. And, Jamie, we all know that when we increase stocking rate or have, less forage resources, we're going to impact animal performance. So, our goal was to at least have the same animal performance on those cattle that were stocked at a lighter stocking rate. And having an increase in average daily gain and increase in stocking rate was very powerful in those two locations, because we increased our total body weight gain per acre by over double. And then when we did the economics on this, with the price of the distillers cubes and everything, we were able to triple or more than triple our net return per acre. At that supply range site, we went from $6 per acre net return on our negative control, doubling it to right at $12 per acre profit with the positive control, which would be what our normal best management practice would be. And then increasing again up to right at $20 per acre with our higher supplement, higher stocking rate. There at Clemmy Range, we saw similar results. Over the 2 years with the Clemmy Range data, we increased average daily gain in the early season over both years, both a wet year and a dry year, by right at 0.75 pounds per day with that supplement, even though we increased that stocking rate. When we compared the positive control to our negative control, across both years, there was no difference in those cattle when we were feeding them, the supplement during the late season as far as average daily gain goes. But over the entire summer, we increased on the average our average daily gain across both years by about 0.4 pounds per day. And, that's also with that increased stocking rate. So once again, we, in both a wet year and a dry year, we nearly doubled gain per acre, animal unit grazing days per acre. And, we're evaluating the range condition, to see, how much residual forage is left after the grazing season. So, last year in that wet year, we didn't have any effect on the residual forage available to those cattle after we pulled cattle off. So really exciting results with that.
I'm really excited to see the additive effect of the increased stocking rate with the gain on some of your Western Oklahoma information. That, like you'd mentioned, that's not commonly seen.
Yeah, when I saw it last year, I was pretty excited. I knew how powerful that was going to be economically, the potential for something that will work across multiple years and different conditions.
Out of Oklahoma State University, that's Stocker cattle nutritionist Paul Beck, joining K-State's Jaymelynn Farney to discuss his recent study of cubed distillers grains as a supplement for stockers on grass. We'd invite you to look up the entire podcast by searching for Dr. J's Beef. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in its 96th year of service to agriculture in Kansas and the Midwest. Eric Atkinson here, and now on to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. And still no winner declared in the presidential race. It's going to be a while before that's resolved. But elsewhere on the election front, the most significant shift for agriculture was the loss by House Agriculture Committee Chairman Collin Peterson, Democrat in Minnesota's 7th District. Peterson had been in Congress for 30 years and well understood production agriculture, often aggressively defending it, especially to the Democratic House caucus. But the western Minnesota district has been trending more Republican over the years, while Peterson had continued to win because of his agricultural support there. This time, though, President Trump won all but one county in that Minnesota 7th District, and that offered some coattails for former Lieutenant Governor Michelle Fischbach to win the seat from Peterson, 53 to 39%. That's going to obviously lead to some adjustments going forward. Top staff will likely change on the committees, and the House Agriculture Committee will now have to bring in a new group of freshmen to become educated on farm policies and programs. The reins of leadership for agricultural policy in Congress will turn over to a new group of leaders. However, a group that already has a wealth of agricultural committee experience. Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan likely will remain the top Democrat on the Senate Agriculture Committee. She had a prior stint as chairman, as you know, and likely will remain a policy force on that committee. Arkansas Senator John Boozman is the lead candidate to take over on the GOP side for the retiring Pat Roberts, likely as chairman if Republicans maintain hold on the Senate. And Representative David Scott of Georgia or Jim Costa of California are the first in line for Democrats to chair the House committee. For Republicans, Glenn Thompson of Pennsylvania and Rick Crawford of Arkansas are most often named as the candidates to take over the GOP spot on the committee. On tomorrow's broadcast, we'll talk more about the implications of the election results for agriculture with K-State Agricultural Policy Specialist Jenny Ift. So be listening for that. Experts say that the USDA's next crop forecasts should bring us very close to what the final production numbers will be. The USDA's Gary Crawford looks ahead.
USDA is wrapping up its survey work for next week's new production forecast for this season's corn, soybean, and cotton crops. Lance Honig heads the crops branch of USDA's Statistics Service. He told us,
we've been busy reaching out to about 8,000 producers across the country, asking them to give us updates on their expectations of yield for the season.
And for many farmers, these are not expectations. They are finished or very close to finishing the harvest.
So in most cases, these producers are actually giving us yield information based on their actual harvest results.
So we have farmer surveys.
But in addition to that, we've also got our trained enumerators out in nearly 4,000 sample plots, specifically for corn, soybeans, and cotton across the major growing areas.
They're running counts and doing measurements and harvesting samples for lab analysis.
So really getting a lot of finality around these numbers.
So the USDA projections should be pretty close to what the final actual production will be. Those projections coming out Tuesday the 10th, noon Eastern Time. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And in an attempt to level the pork trade with Thailand, the Trump administration this week suspended about $817 million in trade preferences for Thailand that were causing billions of dollars in trade deficits for producers here in the U.S. The decision announced by the U.S. Trade Representative was made under the Generalized System of Preferences program. The program gave duty-free treatment to pork exports from Thailand. The National Pork Producers Council filed a petition with the trade representative back in 2018 asking for the suspension of the trade preferences. The U.S. is Thailand's number one export market, with about $4 billion of a variety of products sent to the U.S. each year. However, Thailand has maintained a near ban on U.S. pork imports through tariffs and several non-tariff barriers. For example, Thailand does not accept uncooked pork or pork offal from the U.S. Even when Thailand grants import licenses to U.S. companies, those companies are often charged large fees. Well, next up for you, here on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And standing by with that is Gregg Hanzlicek. Greg?
Doug Bounds, Kansas State statistician, is joining us. And Doug, it looks like for the Kansas soybean harvest, we continue ahead of a normal pace.
As has been the case pretty much all year with soybeans, we're ahead of last year and ahead of the 5-year average. and that's continued for harvest. As of November 1st, our latest harvested number is 83% complete. We compare that to last year, we were at 66% complete, and the 5-year average of 72%.
Well, let's talk about, knowing that we're ahead of the pace as far as harvest is concerned, what was USDA predicting in their last production number for the Kansas soybean crop?
Well, our last forecast based on October 1 conditions, we were pegging the Kansas soybean crop to be at about 209 million bushels, which if we realize that, that's 12% higher than last year. An all-time record for the state of Kansas.
And how does that compare to some of the higher production totals that we've seen in the past years?
Well, currently the record production in Kansas is almost 202 million bushels, and that was in 2018. And then behind that, 2016 and 2017 are around 192 million bushels.
And Doug, what's the estimate on the number of acres that'll be harvested this year?
We're forecasting 4.75 million acres to be harvested in Kansas. That compares to the record was set in 2017 at 5.11 million acres. We're not the highest amount of acres harvested in the state, but we come in pretty close, number 2.
But that shows you what technology has been able to do for this year's crop, too.
That's right. The breeders have done a really good job with variety selection that worked really well in the state of Kansas, and the producers just continue to improve on the quality of work they do.
Condition-wise, it seems like everything's come together pretty well if that estimate is realized, too.
Yeah, we had crop condition numbers for the first 3 weeks of October, and the good to excellent ratings for all 3 of those weeks hovered around 55%. So half or a little more than half of the crop was considered to be good or excellent condition going into middle or later stages of harvest.
Doug, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
That is Doug Bounds, Kansas State statistician, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Thanks, Greg. We'll be back after this final break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way next on this Agriculture Today, our weekly segment on horticulture topics. And we're winding this particular area down for another season, but we have a few insect considerations for you yet, with Raymond Cloyd joining us, horticultural entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, one more time. Raymond, the main thing that most folks are encountering now would be some of those insects still seeking their winter sanctuary in the home, and among others, Asian ladybird beetles are staging their annual invasion, if you will.
Yeah, that's true, Eric. We're getting some inquiries about these ladybird beetles congregating on the south side of a building and then coming in, and that is true. The Asian ladybird beetle is from China. And in China, the native country, they overwinter in cliffs and hills. Well, Kansas is a little short of those, and so they use homes. And so they'll sun themselves for a couple of days or a week, and then they'll migrate in. And once inside, they'll congregate on the south side in the corners of window sills and things like that. The best thing to do is just if you can caulk the outside and keep them from entering. Once they're inside, you can vacuum them up and just put them outside. Don't squish them. They'll leave a red stain. And so that's pretty much an annual occurrence here, Eric, right. Is that not only Asian ladybird beetles, but box elder bugs, crickets, and a number of these insects come into homes to get away from the environmental conditions. But the Asian ladybird beetle is very prevalent, and people notice it a lot more than some of the others.
Strictly nuisances. That's what these indoor insects are. So people need to keep that well in mind.
Yeah, again, just to vacuum up and put them outside and do that a couple of times during the winter, and things will be okay. I also want to mention, Eric, the Asian giant hornet. We've been getting a number of inquiries about that, and I wanted to provide an update. The Asian giant hornet is in Washington State. It's in Blaine County, and some radio tracking has allowed them to find the nest, and they've destroyed it. And that's an ongoing thing, but we're getting calls that people in Kansas are seeing the Asian giant hornet. What they're likely seeing is the cicada killer, the male particularly. So the Asian giant hornet is not in Kansas yet, but the cicada killer is large. It can be 2 inches plus in length. It's very intimidating, the male. So don't confuse that with the Asian giant hornet. And if you have any questions, you can call our office like people have done recently. And I want to bring that out, that the Asian giant hornet right now is restricted to Washington State and parts of Canada.
That is good news. And, of course, you, others in the Kansas Department of Agriculture and elsewhere will stay right on top of that situation should it ever somehow find its way to Kansas. But, again, the Asian giant hornet, or the murder hornet, as some are calling it, is not in this state. Mm-hmm. One thing that folks can do actively now in the way of horticultural insect control, the application of dormant oils to fruit trees, perhaps other landscape ornamentals, right?
That is correct, Eric. Any plants that are going to go mainly deciduous, lose their leaves this wintertime, if you're having problems like certain scale insects or spider mites that overwinter on the plant, these dormant oils, these are very highly refined oils. They're not the same ones you would use in spring, summer, and fall like the horticultural oils. These are strictly used in the dormant time. Well, they will smother the eggs or the overwintering stage of specific scales and spider mites. And that could help for next year in reducing the populations of either scales or spider mites that would attack. In this case, a lot of fruit trees is a big one, apples and the peaches and nectarines, certain scales that are out there that overwinter on those plants, and then also certain mites. Now, the spruce spider mite overwinters on some conifers. The problem is that you want to be careful with dormant oils on conifers. You can burn them or change their color. So it's mostly for deciduous trees, less so than conifers, Eric.
Well, quickly here, some basic guidelines on application, putting these dormant oils on. It's merely a matter of coating the trunk of that tree? What?
Yeah, and you want to make sure that you make these applications when the ambient air temperature is over 32 degrees Fahrenheit and less than 80 degrees Fahrenheit, because you can burn your plants. So, if we're getting temperatures around 50s, 60s, 70s, those are ideal for making these dormant oil applications.
And one application typically will do it during the winter, or does one need to follow up, Raymond?
That's a good question, Eric. I normally recommend, depending on the extent of the infestation, about 2 applications to cover your bases, yes.
And that second one can go on any time during an open part of the winter then?
Right. If you read the label directions, they might tell you recommendations for intervals between applications, but I would make one application, then follow that about 2 weeks later with the second application.
Even if one has treated their, say, fruit tree in the past with a dormant oil, it doesn't hurt to do this as an annual routine, Raymond?
Well, if you continue to have problems with certain scales and spider mites, yes. If you're not, then there is no need to spend the time and labor spraying. But in most cases, certain scales and mites are going to be problematic on a yearly basis. Yeah.
Take a look, scout your trees, see if they could benefit from a dormant oil application here in the fairly near future, as long as the ambient temperature, is above that 32-degree mark. Again, this will be the last time we visit for the season, Raymond, as we are moving on into more winter-like conditions here soon. But you'd advise folks to take full advantage of what you and your colleagues in Extension Entomology at K-State have been doing of late in accumulating all sorts of information on insect control, in crops for sure, but in your case, in horticultural settings, and do a little homework in anticipation of what might happen next year with insects.
Yeah, what will happen is when you're not traveling and you're staying in your office, well, what do? You develop extension publications, and we have developed quite a few. And what will happen is probably next week or the week after our newsletter, I will have an article on dormant oils and one on the listing of publications that have been produced in 2020. To give you a preview, we've got Colorado potato beetle, striped spotted cucumber beetle, whiteflies, a number of them that are really relevant for horticultural crops, whether it be landscape vegetables or fruits. And so that'll be available to anybody. There are going to be PDFs. You download them for free from the bookstore. So, if you're sitting there, nothing to do on a cold winter day, there's some good information to go on.
Raymond, a pleasure to work with you, not just here, but throughout the past growing season. And in 2021, we'll do it again. Many thanks to you.
Oh, you're always welcome, Eric, and I look forward to working with you again in 2021.
Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist, K-State Research and Extension. That is this week's horticulture segment, tying off this Thursday edition. Thanks to you for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.